The night air of London carried a brittle chill, yet within the gilded halls of the Ashcombe residence, warmth and gaslight battled the shadows with an almost frantic insistence. The city's elite had gathered in a flurry of silks and whispers, the murmur of anticipation and judgment mingling in the vast ballroom. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, the sole daughter of a family once esteemed yet now tethered precariously to the waning fortunes of nobility, stood at the threshold, her slender gloved hands clasped before her, trembling imperceptibly beneath the weight of expectation. She was dressed in a gown of the palest dove gray, embroidered with threads of silver that caught the chandelier's fractured light. The dress, elegant yet modest, seemed to announce her presence without claiming undue attention, a careful balance that mirrored the life she had been taught to lead, restrained, dutiful, unseen, and less observed. The moment she entered, the room seemed to hold its breath. Noblemen in embroidered coats and velvet waistcoats angled their bodies subtly, assessing the newcomer with a combination of curiosity and condescension. Gentlewomen leaned toward one another, fans lifted as shields and instruments of scrutiny, murmuring remarks that fluttered like moths in the candlelight. "A charming girl, though not particularly striking," one whispered, voice edged with delicate disdain. "Ah, but the Duke of Blackwood has claimed her. Fortune or folly, who can say?" Eleanor's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. She had learned, over the course of a carefully disciplined upbringing, the art of concealing alarm behind a placid expression, yet her heart rebelled against the icy sting of whispered gossip. It was at the announcement of her engagement to the formidable Duke of Blackwood that Eleanor felt the first true tremor of humiliation. The Duke, a man of imposing stature, whose presence commanded both awe and fear, had chosen to appear without the customary airs of ceremony for the evening. Instead of a bow, he inclined his head with an austere formality, his dark eyes assessing her with a gravity that seemed to weigh the very air between them. The hall, accustomed to the Duke's wealth and influence, seemed to shrink under his gaze, the glitter of chandeliers and gold-framed mirrors unable to compete with the force of his authority. Eleanor's cheeks flushed beneath her composure, a subtle rebellion of blood against her deliberate calm. She had anticipated a cold reception, yet the precise sharpness of his manner, the unspoken message of possession wrapped in decorum, unsettled her in ways she had not foreseen. Guests pressed forward with polite inquiry, their voices layered with the honeyed tones of civility, yet edged with the jagged whispers of social rivalry. "Do you anticipate happiness in this union?" a peer asked, tilting her head with a smile that carried the weight of expectation and judgment alike. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, her answer caught between honesty and the pretense demanded by her station. I hope to serve my family's honor," she replied, each word chosen with painstaking care, the syllables measured as if on a scale, delicate as porcelain teetering on the edge of a table. It was not a confession of desire, for in truth her heart had yet to conceive any notion of happiness in this arranged marriage. It was a declaration of duty, a fragile statement that sought to satisfy propriety while shielding her inner despair. Amid the swirl of conversation, Eleanor caught sight of the Duke again. He moved with a quiet deliberation, his presence a tether she could not escape, each measured step a reminder of the life awaiting her beyond the ballroom's gilded walls. There was a loneliness in his posture, subtle yet unmistakable, as if the weight of accumulated years and responsibilities had etched themselves into the very lines of his face. His gaze lingered on a distant mirror, reflecting not just her image, but the inescapable reality of her new existence. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar stir of curiosity, a tentative recognition that perhaps the man behind the formidable reputation was more than the sum of whispered fears and societal exaggerations. A minor incident unfolded that sent a ripple through the assembled guests, further marking Eleanor's evening with discomfort. A visiting cousin, gleeful in her own social cunning, allowed a careless word to escape, hinting at Eleanor's modest inheritance and the Duke's presumed motives. The hall's laughter, polite but sharp, brushed against Eleanor's ears like cold water, and she felt the sting of shame burn her throat. Yet she did not retreat in panic. Instead, she straightened, chin lifted, embodying the fragile dignity her mother had instilled in her. It was in these moments Eleanor realized that courage was not a dramatic flourish, but the quiet endurance of one's own composure, the ability to navigate the courtly battlefield without surrendering the heart entirely. When the evening drew to its close, Eleanor found herself standing before the towering gates of Blackwood Manor, the carriage that had conveyed her from her family home now silent in the cobblestone courtyard. The manor itself loomed like a sentinel of destiny, its stone walls cold and imposing, turrets piercing the fog-laden night sky. She felt a shiver that had little to do with the autumn chill. It was the weight of obligation, the anticipation of a life dictated by duty rather than desire. Yet, within that shiver, faint as the glimmer of dawn on distant horizons, was a seed of expectation, a fragile, unspoken hope that perhaps within these walls, between the shadows and the candlelight, something unforeseen might yet bloom. As she ascended the steps, the manor's massive doors creaking with the solemnity of centuries, Eleanor's mind wrestled with the dichotomy of her existence, the life prescribed by her family's honor and the whispered possibility of a heart that could someday belong to her own choosing. She paused at the threshold of the grand hall, inhaling the scent of aged wood and burning tallow, and in that instant, she understood that her story was no longer hers alone. The Duke awaited her, not merely as an emblem of obligation, but as a man whose heart, like her own, might conceal unexpected depths. And in the quiet surrender to that truth, Eleanor felt the faintest tremor of anticipation, a herald of the journey that would soon entwine two lives in the fragile, dangerous, and exquisite pursuit of love. The first morning at Blackwood Manor greeted Eleanor with a chill that penetrated even the warmth of the drawing-room hearth. The vast chambers smelled of polished wood and old parchment, the scent of history mingling with the faint trace of wax candles left burning through the night. Curtains of heavy velvet framed towering windows, their folds spilling shadows across the carpeted floors, and the grandeur of the manor pressed upon her like a silent testament to the Duke's formidable presence. She moved through the halls with careful grace, her skirts whispering against the polished stone, her heart caught in the delicate tension of curiosity and apprehension. Every corner seemed imbued with the weight of expectation. Every painting, every carved panel, a reminder that she had entered a world where appearances governed reality. The Duke appeared at mid-morning, his silhouette emerging from the shadowed corridor like a figure from a portrait, dark and commanding. He offered no bow, only a measured nod that seemed to mark her passage into his dominion. His gaze lingered on her with that same inscrutable gravity that had unsettled her at the ball. Yet beneath the stern facade, there was a flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, of attention paid solely to her presence. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, not with fear alone, but with a cautious intrigue. It was the first acknowledgment that, beneath the rigid exterior, the man she was bound to might harbor depths yet unseen. Breakfast passed in near silence, the clink of porcelain and the rustle of napkins filling the spaces between words. The Duke's questions were sparse but deliberate, probing without intrusion, a subtle test of her composure and wit. "Do you enjoy reading, Lady Eleanor?" he inquired finally, his voice low yet resonant, carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. Eleanor met his gaze, steadying the tremor in her hands. "I find books to be companions," she replied softly, each word carefully chosen. "They offer counsel where circumstance allows none." He inclined his head ever so slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than approval, and Eleanor noted the precision in it, the hint that he valued discretion and thoughtfulness. By midday, Eleanor explored the manor more freely, tracing her fingers along the carved balustrades of staircases and pausing to observe the portraits of past dukes, their eyes seemingly fixed upon her, silent witnesses of centuries. She discovered the library, a sanctum of towering shelves and muted light, where dust motes danced like golden motes in the sunbeam that pierced a high window. Here, she felt a measure of solace. Here, she could breathe beneath the weight of scrutiny. And it was here that the Duke found her, moving with a quiet deliberation that contrasted with the usual formalities of his manner. In his hand, he held a small object, wrapped in delicate tissue, which he extended toward her with a fleeting softness that seemed almost indecent in its tenderness. "A token," he said simply, his dark eyes flickering with an emotion Eleanor could not immediately name. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a carved writing desk, its surface polished to a shine, drawers miniature and precise, designed to hold notes or small treasures. "I thought it might serve you," he continued, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "to remind you that even in duty there is room for personal care." Eleanor's fingers hovered over the smooth wood, and a warmth she had not anticipated rose in her chest. The gesture was small, almost ordinary, yet in the Duke's hands it became profound, a declaration that the rigid walls around his heart might indeed harbor tenderness. Her days passed in a careful rhythm, attending to household routines and observing the Duke's peculiarities. He was a man of few indulgences, yet his attention to detail revealed a mind that prized precision and restraint. Eleanor noted the brief moments when his guard lowered, a sigh at the sight of a well-kept garden, the way he lingered over a letter from a distant relation, the quiet intensity with which he examined the day's ledger. These glimpses, fleeting as they were, drew her curiosity, and in turn, the Duke seemed to notice her attentiveness. He began to speak in measured phrases that carried double meaning, polite, yet imbued with the subtle weight of observation and expectation. It was during a midday call from a visiting cousin that Eleanor's fortitude faced its next trial. The woman, an air of polished superiority masking sharp envy, allowed her tongue to wander into perilous territory, hinting at Eleanor's modest inheritance and questioning the Duke's motives. Laughter rippled through the drawing room, polite but barbed, and Eleanor felt the familiar flush of humiliation creep into her cheeks. Yet she did not falter entirely. She met the woman's gaze with measured calm, her voice a carefully modulated whisper of dignity. "Fortune is seldom the measure of character," she said, words quiet yet firm. And in that instant, a subtle silence fell, the sort that acknowledged a quiet but undeniable triumph of composure. Evenings at Blackwood Manor carried a different weight, the transition from day to night bringing with it the flickering intimacy of candlelight. Eleanor dined in a room of towering windows, the rain tapping against the glass, the Duke seated opposite her with a composure that was near regal. Conversation became less formal, his inquiries shifting from duty to personal reflection, probing her intellect, her memories, her quiet preferences. "Do you ever find solace in the gardens?" he asked one evening, his voice a low murmur against the patter of rain. Eleanor inclined her head, recalling a sunlit corner she had discovered earlier. "I do," she admitted, "for in the solitude of nature, I am less observed, less bound by expectation." He nodded, and for a brief moment, the air between them was charged not with authority, but with recognition, a shared understanding that each navigated worlds of constraint and hidden longing. It was in the late hours, after the manor had succumbed to silence, that the Duke presented the evening's most profound gesture. In the private chamber, under the soft glow of candlelight, he extended a delicate, handcrafted locket. Its surface gleamed faintly, intricate filigree winding like ivy around a small, hidden compartment. "For you," he said simply, his voice low, carrying an intimacy that transcended propriety. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she accepted it, and in that fleeting moment, the weight of obligation seemed to lift, if only slightly. Her breath caught, heart stirring with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The locket was more than an object. It was a promise, a hint that beneath the austere exterior lay a capacity for care that had remained hidden, even to himself. As she fastened the locket around her neck, Eleanor felt a shift within her, subtle but undeniable. The walls of her trepidation wavered, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself a measure of hope. Duty still bound her to the Duke, but now, in the quiet intimacy of candlelight and whispered gesture, she glimpsed the possibility that love, unbidden and unannounced, might yet take root between them. The manor, vast and imposing, seemed slightly less forbidding, its shadows softened by the golden glow that fell across her delicate features. And in that moment, Eleanor understood that her journey had begun, not as a passive participant in a predetermined fate, but as a woman who might, in time, awaken a man's heart as profoundly as her own had stirred. The morning mist clung to the gardens of Blackwood Manor like a gauzy veil, softening the rigid lines of hedges and wrought iron railings into blurred silhouettes. Eleanor wandered along the gravel paths, her skirts trailing lightly over the dewy stones, each step careful and deliberate. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and budding flowers, and in this solitude she found a reprieve from the ever-watchful eyes of society and household staff. The manor, for all its grandeur and imposing walls, seemed quieter here, gentler, as if the landscape itself conspired to shelter her from the suffocating expectations of duty. She paused by a fountain, its waters murmuring softly, and allowed herself a moment to breathe, to consider the strange, new pulse of possibility that had entered her life since the gift of the locket. It was then that the Duke appeared, silent as a shadow slipping between trees, his presence at once commanding and understated. Eleanor startled slightly, but did not step back. There was an ease between them here, removed from the formalities of the drawing room or the eyes of gossiping guests. He approached slowly, the gravel crunching faintly beneath his boots, and for the first time she noticed the subtle fatigue etched into the lines of his face. The weight of years and responsibility seemed to press upon him even in this moment of casual proximity, yet there was a vulnerability in his posture that softened his formidable aura. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low and measured, as if testing the air between them for its capacity to carry truth. "Do you find these gardens agreeable?" His question was simple, yet it carried an undercurrent of significance, as though seeking a measure of her inner world rather than the superficial opinion society demanded. Eleanor tilted her head, her eyes tracing the delicate pattern of ivy curling along the fountain's edge. "They offer solitude," she replied, "and a freedom of thought that one seldom experiences within walls so heavily adorned with expectation." Her words, careful yet sincere, seemed to reach him, for a subtle change crossed his expression, a flicker of acknowledgment, a recognition that she understood more than she let on. He leaned against the stone balustrade, folding his hands, and regarded her in silence for a moment that stretched into something intimate, almost tangible. "Solitude," he murmured, "is a luxury I have rarely afforded myself. The demands of rank, the constant scrutiny, one learns to bear it, yet it does not ease the heart's longing." Eleanor's breath caught, for in this admission lay a confession of isolation that mirrored her own. She stepped closer, emboldened by a curiosity tempered with caution. "And yet," she said softly, "one finds small reprieves, hidden corners, moments in which the world may, for a time, be set aside." Their conversation flowed with a rare intimacy, each sentence a delicate exchange of concealed truths. The Duke spoke of past regrets, of a life measured in duty rather than desire, his voice tinged with a quiet melancholy that drew Eleanor's empathy. He spoke of the loss of his late wife, not with bitterness, but with a measured sorrow that seemed to haunt his otherwise unyielding demeanor. Eleanor listened, her heart responding to the tenderness beneath his stoicism, recognizing in him a man both formidable and profoundly human. And in turn, she revealed fragments of her own apprehensions, the tension between her family's expectations and the stirrings of a heart unaccustomed to such freedom. A sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves, drawing their attention to the movement of branches and the soft cascade of petals across the path. In that instant, Eleanor's hand brushed against the Duke's as they reached simultaneously for a fallen blossom. The contact, fleeting yet electric, drew a subtle tension through them, a tangible reminder of the unspoken attraction threading its way between careful civility and private desire. Neither spoke, yet the shared glance that followed carried the weight of acknowledgement, an understanding that their connection had shifted beyond mere propriety into a realm fraught with vulnerability and possibility. The afternoon passed in a series of quiet, intertwined moments. They strolled along the winding paths, spoke of literature and music, and Eleanor discovered the Duke's surprising attentiveness to detail, his passion for subtle artistry hidden beneath layers of authority. He revealed the careful precision with which he tended to his estates, the way he cherished the delicate bloom of a rose as much as the ledger of accounts that dictated the manor's fortunes. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own interests and observations, her voice gaining confidence as the veil of fear and obligation lifted incrementally. With each exchange, the barriers of formality softened, replaced by a cautious intimacy that neither had anticipated but both felt compelled to explore. Yet even in this growing closeness, society's invisible presence remained an ever-looming specter. A distant carriage rattled along the gravel drive, reminding them of the outside world and its unyielding expectations. Eleanor's composure returned, measured and deliberate, but the warmth in her chest lingered, a subtle rebellion against the dictates of duty. The Duke's gaze followed her, heavy with unspoken question, and for a moment, the tension between restraint and yearning became almost unbearable. They were two souls, bound by obligation, yet drawn inexorably toward one another, navigating a delicate dance where each gesture, each glance, carried the weight of meaning and the risk of misinterpretation. As twilight descended, painting the gardens in shades of amber and violet, Eleanor and the Duke found themselves seated upon a stone bench beneath an ancient oak. The locket she wore gleamed faintly in the dim light, a talisman of the bond that had begun to form between them. The Duke's expression softened, the rigid lines of his face giving way to a contemplative serenity. "I am grateful," he said quietly, "for this companionship, if one may call it such. You see beyond the facade, Lady Eleanor, in ways few have dared." Eleanor met his gaze, understanding the depth of the admission. "And I," she replied, "am compelled to learn the truth of the man, not merely the title he bears." A silence fell between them, neither compelled to break it, for the air itself seemed to pulse with the recognition of burgeoning trust and desire. The shadows lengthened, embracing the gardens in a gentle, protective shroud, and Eleanor felt a tremor of hope stir within her. Duty still bound her, yet in the quiet confession of shared vulnerabilities, in the subtle intimacies of glance and gesture, she glimpsed a path that might lead to something deeper than mere obligation. The locket at her chest seemed to thrum with quiet promise, a tangible emblem of the tentative bridge forming between two hearts. When the hour grew late and the manor's windows reflected the deepening night, Eleanor rose, her movements deliberate and poised. The Duke remained seated a moment longer, his gaze following her with a mixture of admiration and restrained longing. As she ascended the steps toward her chambers, Eleanor understood that the walls surrounding them both were not impenetrable. They were negotiable, fragile, and perhaps, just perhaps, capable of yielding to the subtle force of genuine affection. And in that recognition, a quiet anticipation blossomed, a delicate promise that the next chapter of their lives, intertwined by circumstance, might yet unfold in ways neither had dared to imagine. The first light of dawn spilled over the rolling lawns of Blackwood Manor, painting the horizon in muted hues of rose and gold. Eleanor stood at the window of her chamber, her fingers resting lightly on the cool glass as she watched the mist retreat from the gardens she had come to love. The locket at her throat caught the pale sunlight, gleaming faintly, a constant, tender reminder of the quiet intimacy that had begun to root itself between her and the Duke. Though duty still bound her invisible chains, the invisible ones that tethered her heart were fraying, replaced by a cautious, exhilarating anticipation. Today, she sensed, might demand more of them both than whispered words or fleeting glances had ever required. A hurried knock sounded at her door, interrupting her reverie. "Lady Eleanor," called a soft voice, "the Duke requests your presence in the library. He has urgent matters to discuss." Eleanor's pulse quickened, a flutter of anxiety mingling with curiosity. She smoothed her gown, a dove-gray cascade trimmed with silver threads, and descended the wide staircase with careful grace. The manor, usually imposing in its grandeur, seemed to pulse with expectancy, as if even the walls sensed the imminence of revelation. Each step carried the weight of possibility, the delicate promise that the private bond she and the Duke had nurtured might finally be acknowledged. The library was bathed in the golden glow of morning light, the shelves of polished oak towering like silent witnesses to centuries of thought and memory. The Duke stood near the hearth, his posture both commanding and unguarded, a rare vulnerability etched across his stern features. He turned as Eleanor entered, and for a moment, the formal air of authority gave way to something profoundly human, a gaze charged with the weight of emotion long restrained. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice a low resonance that vibrated with gravity and quiet tenderness, "I find myself compelled to speak what I have so carefully concealed." Eleanor's heart thudded, a wild rhythm of apprehension and hope. She inclined her head, silent, allowing him the space to speak, as though the very act of listening could shape the course of destiny. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing with the inevitability of truth. "From the first night," he continued, "when I placed the locket in your hands, I recognized a sentiment, the capacity for understanding that I had long thought impossible in another. I was hardened by years, bound by expectation, by grief, by the relentless scrutiny of society. Yet, in your presence, Lady Eleanor, I find a heart that sees me, that dares to recognize me as I am, beyond the title, beyond the man others presume me to be." His words hung in the air, a fragile bridge of honesty extending from his heart to hers. Eleanor's breath caught, a quiet tremor betraying the tumult of emotion she had so carefully concealed. "Your acknowledgment," she whispered, "reveals more than admiration, I think. It hints at affection, at the tenderest stirrings of regard, and I cannot deny that I have come to feel similarly." Her voice was steady, but each syllable trembled with the weight of revelation. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but a space charged with all that had passed between them. The stolen glances, the shared confidences, the subtle intimacies of gesture and thought. The Duke reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers, grounding her in the reality of their shared understanding. "Then you would not reject me?" he asked, the rare vulnerability in his tone a mirror of her own tentative courage. Eleanor's lips curved in the faintest acknowledgment of both relief and hope. "I would not," she replied softly, "for in truth, I have come to recognize that the heart may defy duty, may navigate the strictures of society, and still find that which it has long sought." The words, though gentle, carried the weight of liberation, freeing them both from the constraints that had bound them in propriety and expectation. A distant toll of the manor bell marked the passage of time, yet within the library, time seemed suspended, each heartbeat and breath magnified by the gravity of the moment. The Duke's gaze softened further, and he lowered himself into a chair beside her, drawing her hand into both of his. "Then let us," he murmured, "chart a course together. Let us navigate the world not merely as obliged partners, but as two souls who recognize in one another the capacity for loyalty, for courage, and, above all, for love." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a quiet, profound joy. She had anticipated a life constrained by expectation, yet here was a reality more tender and vivid, than she had dared to imagine. Their conversation flowed then, less formal, more intimate, a series of shared reflections that solidified the bond that had slowly, almost imperceptibly, grown between them. They spoke of dreams once abandoned, of moments lost to grief and duty, of hopes that had lingered quietly in the heart's shadow. Each word was a stitch in a tapestry of mutual understanding, weaving a future that neither had dared to claim alone. The locket, resting against Eleanor's chest, gleamed with the soft luminescence of morning sun, a tangible emblem of trust, intimacy, and the promise of days yet to unfold. The moment of confession transitioned naturally into a gesture, simple yet profoundly resonant. The Duke took a small rose from a vase upon the mantel, its petals a pale blush that mirrored Eleanor's own gentle warmth. He placed it delicately in her hand, their fingers brushing lightly, the contact sending a tremor of recognition and hope through both. A token, he said, echoing the gesture of that first night, to remind us that even amidst the expectations of the world, there exists beauty, care, and devotion. Eleanor's lips curved in a smile, her heart swelling with the affirmation of unspoken truths. As the day unfolded, the manor seemed transformed, no longer an edifice of rigid authority, but a place softened by the recognition of affection and mutual respect. Servants moved quietly. The gardens appeared more inviting. The light fell with a gentler warmth through the towering windows. Eleanor and the Duke walked together along the dew-kissed paths, hands entwined, their steps measured yet unhesitating, each carrying the knowledge that they had claimed, in each other, both solace and exhilaration. The societal expectations remained, but within the private sphere of their hearts, a love both deliberate and tender had taken root, resilient against the weight of tradition and the whispers of the world outside. Evening descended with a cascade of amber light, and the manor, illuminated by the soft glow of innumerable candles, embraced them in a quiet intimacy. The Duke, seated before the fire, extended a hand toward Eleanor once more. "Shall we, then, begin our life as it ought to be lived?" he asked, the simplicity of the question carrying the gravity of commitment. Eleanor placed her hand in his, the warmth of his palm a reassurance and a promise. "Yes," she whispered, "as it ought to be lived together." And in that final, delicate affirmation, the tension of duty and expectation yielded to the clarity of love, leaving them both poised at the beginning of a future shaped not merely by societal decree, but by the tender, enduring power of the heart. As night settled over Blackwood Manor, the locket gleamed faintly against Eleanor's gown, the rose's petals resting softly on the table, and the manor itself seemed to sigh with relief and promise. Two hearts, once bound by obligation and trepidation, now beat in quiet harmony, aware that the journey ahead, though still framed by the expectations of their world, will be navigated with courage, intimacy, and a love that had been earned through patience, understanding, and unspoken devotion. And in the quiet, golden glow of candlelight, Eleanor and the Duke, once strangers bound by duty, found in each other a truth more profound than propriety, more enduring than reputation, and infinitely more precious than they had ever dared to hope.